Okay, so hundreds of thousands of years ago the Anunnaki came to Earth. They were a bunch of technologically advanced war criminals fleeing their home system looking for a new place to settle down. On Earth they found valuable minerals and a race of primitive humans. These humans had powerful spiritual abilities but simple needs. They could use plant life as communication relays, alter biological matter with their minds, and had some sort of super intuition. They were also basically monkeys, so they used these powers only to stay fed and safe. The Anunnaki introduced their genetics into this population. They uplifted these monkeys, making them more beautiful and intelligent, at least in their creator's eyes. Of course, in this process, their spiritual balance was thrown off and their powers lost, so they were forced to rely on their new masters. In time the Anunnaki became powerful god kings of Earth. They reveled in wealth and power, which in turn attracted more aliens to come and mingle on their glorious planet. There were some mild-mannered blue people, psychopathic reptilians, and mystical nomadic Lemurians. Earth became one big alien melting pot with humans smack dab in the middle. Of course, all good things come to an end. The Anunnaki were incurably proud bastards, and Jehovah was the most powerful and bastardly of them all. They broke into factions and spent centuries backstabbing and eventually bombing themselves into nothing. Their remnants realized how badly they fucked up and fucked off to the Pleiades to live as monks. Earth, taken as a wash, was left to its own devices. And that's the prologue. After the gods had left, humanity had to get their shit together. They muddle around a bit, learning to think on their own, develop culture and technology again. They needed to figure out exactly what their spirituality was. They had some memory of their old powers, which they could access with the right understanding. They had memories of the old god kings as well as shit implanted by reptilians and the beliefs brought by other aliens. The fuckers who came out on top were the Atlanteans. They were our race, which looked like a cross between Romans and American natives. They had figured out how to use some of the old Anunnaki tech and built an empire around it. Their gods had evolved into three archons of reasons, personifications of the guiding principles of Atlantean life. They created the megacity-state of Atlantis, from which they spread out, conquering vast swaths of the world. They created vassals which used enormous slave forces to harvest wealth to be sent back to the city. This was a world of petty medieval barons paying tribute to assholes on hover sleds. Pilgrims riding giant ostriches across endless fields hoping they can find shelter from Earth's fucked up weather patterns. Alien monks wandering the countryside trying to recover their lost knowledge. Crazy shit. So among the enslaved people of Atlantis were the Lemurians. They were a tall, powerfully built people with cinnamon skin and red or auburn hair and related to the pharaohs. They descended from shamans who had learned rituals which allowed them to bend space. They had traveled the cosmos on a continuous journey, settling from time to time. Those who had decided to stay on Earth regretted it. Over the years their sedentary lifestyle had made them forget the rituals of old. Their religion, one that had been the root for the Atlanteans' beliefs, had faded into superstition. They had lost their independence and became prey to other civilizations. There was a massive coastal city under a particularly harsh Atlantean king. It was here that the Conqueror was born. He was a slave like all Lemurians, weaned on tales of their old gods, of a fearsome and loving goddess. There were tales of how the gods still roamed the earth in desolate places waiting for their followers to join them. He loved the stories, but as he grew he quickly realized their futility. His mother was taken from him by some unknown man when he was very little. He knew no loving God would let his people suffer this way, and no fearsome God would leave them unavenged. When he was 14 his sister was raped and killed. On that day he flew into a rage and killed the men responsible, then fled into the mountains. He wandered beyond the city with his eye on a mountain he had seen from the rooftops as a child. It was tall and barren and he intended to die upon its peak. For days he climbed, driven by will alone. If he was doomed, then he would die looking out on the world. The only living things upon the mountainside were dry grass, enormous locusts, larger than a man's fist, and the boy. The locust would bite and scratch, but when they did, he catch them and eat them. So in a way he was thankful. But they were scarce nonetheless, and the boy began to starve. He reached the mountain peak as nothing more than skin and bones, but below him was the city where he had spent his whole life. And for a moment he was content to die. But then a voice spoke out. It was a woman's voice. He turned to see her, a Lemurian woman, neither young nor old, holding sword. A massive sword. She said, "Conquer yourself." So he took the sword. Even though he was young and on the verge of death, he found he could lift it. He felt the weight but knew that it was one he could wield naturally. So his will had changed. With sword in hand he descended the mountain. He ate locusts as he went, and by the time he had reached the bottom he found he was stronger than he had ever been. The boy never once stopped to talk or question as he entered the city. He strode through the gates and began the slaughter. Others saw the lunatic boy running through the streets killing Atlanteans left and right, and they joined him. The city rose up in an apocalyptic riot with the boy and his sword at its head. They killed the king, his men and his family. They took all they could from the city and burned the rest to the ground. So the boy became a conqueror and his people become his horde. He traveled the countryside unseating barons, looting their lands and taking any man that wished to join his conquest. Atlantis was far away and even those with technology could not use it. To great effect his mass of zealous warriors. The rule of the city-state was in its dying days, folding to infighting and ignorance. Everything that it could not care to hold was swept away by the conqueror. His men took what they could use, and in time wise men began to flock to his side. A tribe that had learned how to domesticate horses was folded into the horde, and a method of mounted combat was developed that was not possible on birds. On one campaign he discovered the beauty of wine. He had taken captive wealthy soldier turned winemaker who shared a glass with him. They laughed and talked and considered the divinity of the drink. The conqueror thanked the man for his bounty. The winemaker was happy to have his work appreciated but lamented the fact that his fields and home had been burned to the ground. The conqueror would think on this a long while. The winemaker eventually became one of his generals. As he battled across the continent, the conqueror would find himself questioning his existence more and more. There was one mighty king who reached out to the conqueror with a wish to make peace. He offered a meeting in his palace as equals to discuss if not a truce then a peaceful surrender on the part of the king and his men. The conqueror was now a man in his mid to late 20s, but already he had started to feel old. He didn't trust the king, but he knew there had to be some change in his world. He was driven both by pain and confidence in his own power. He met the king in his throne room and was betrayed. The men he brought as his bodyguards were apprehended and he was seized. Although it took many men, he was disarmed, and with great effort the king lifted his sword. He was impaled with his own blade. The king twisted it and pulled it out, leaving the conqueror to die on the palace floor. All the court and conqueror's men watched as he slowly bled out. He lay there. For a moment he was at peace, thinking of his mother and sister. He hung in warm blackness for a while. But through it he heard a voice. It was not the goddess but his own. It was firm and simple, and it said, "Get up." So he stood. As he stared the king in the eyes, he plunged his fist into his own wound. And for a moment the court thought he was a god. The conqueror walked out of the city and rejoined his army, then he collapsed. The horde found a quiet place in the mountains to set camp. The conqueror was placed upon a ridge overlooking the camp. A frame was constructed to hold him upright so he could watch over his people. Wise women tended to the wound that should have been fatal with foul-smelling ointments. There he took the years he needed to recover while his army waited. He could not move, he could barely speak, he could eat only what he needed to stay alive. Since becoming divine he was visited only by those needed to sustain his body. It was here that he faced his greatest struggle and where he contemplated the words of his goddess, "Conquer yourself." The conqueror had no choice but to face the enemies that had existed in himself. He could do nothing but sit and listen to the world that he worked so long to dominate. He tracked the rise of the sun and the moon. He listened to every bird song and counted every star. He watched his people below live their lives, watched them learn and be born and die. He learned to feel his body and the wind on it. Where before his will was tool he used in combat, now it was more. He and it were inseparable. For a time he fell in love with Moon. I'm not sure what this has to do with the rest of the story, but he did. He ordered what bare rags he had removed so he could spiritually consummate his marriage to his cosmic lover. And he became one with the wind. It became part of his soul and he learned to travel beyond his body. He transcended the role of conqueror, he fought his final battle and became the master. Healed from his wounds, he got up and descended to his camp. In his absence his people had become prosperous and peaceful and he had fallen into legend. Many were afraid to see him again, afraid of what his divine wrath might bring. Some were excited to be led into battle once again. He accepted that he was both divine and a victorious warrior but refused to lead. He was master of himself and the universe as he knew it, nothing more. So he offered to teach instead. Many of his generals were disappointed and left to find their own glory, as did many of the common people who had lost faith in their God. But some did stay and become his disciples. He taught them about nature, and the strange sciences he had learned in dreams and deep and powerful meditations and magic. But the power he had learned could not be fully explained, and in time his students had to leave to learn for themselves. And so they founded strange and brutal mystery schools where they would chase enlightenment. And the master, with his duty fulfilled, turned his body to wind and embarked to explore the world and then the cosmos. The end. Side note. Cell towers specifically. The Pleiades since becoming chipmunks have been trying to help out humanity to make up for leaving the place in such a mess. However, all our signals make it difficult for their own to get through. It might be part of a reptilian plot to keep us from communicating to the outside. Also Greys, the big-eyed, butt-probing, Roswell dudes are a failed Anunnaki experiment. The one that would inspire Prometheus tried to make a replacement for humans so he could be impediment from Earth. He failed and created some creepy little soulless dudes who are trapped in constant despair. Now they fly around in old Anunnaki ships kidnapping humans and breeding with them for those sweet, sweet genes. If they can't have souls, maybe their kids can. And most of these aliens use tech to hide themselves on a slightly different plane of existence that overlaps our own. It's the same plane where ghosts live. So some haunting our ghosts and some are alien probe teams. Naturally, some secret societies use the plane for their own nefarious purposes. The plane also happens to vibrate at the frequency required for precognition.